welcome to all of you. Good afternoon. I'm Divya Chander. I'm an anesthesiologist. I'm a neuroscientist. And I'm also a consciousness explorer like all of you today. And I'm going to take you on a very interesting journey that involves mapping consciousness. Now, I've been wondering about consciousness since I was a child. But one of the things, as I got older and became a scientist, it was really difficult to define what consciousness was and thereby study it scientifically. But arguably, studying consciousness is one of the most important things that we as humans could do together as a species. It's about the very essence of who we are. Now let's explore maybe why it's difficult to define and map consciousness. I'm standing here, and I'm looking at this monitor, and there's light hitting my eyes coming from here, wavelengths, 670 nanometers. I see red. But you, and you, when you bind 670 nanometers in the photoreceptors of your eye, is your red the same as my red? This issue is something that the neurophilosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And he was not the only one. This has been something that has been appreciated for a long time. This is a quote attributed to Sir Isaac Newton from about 1672. To determine by what modes or actions light produceth in our minds the phantasm of color is not so easy. Well, this approach to understanding consciousness relies on one thing. It derives from the perspective that we can define consciousness by describing the contents of consciousness, awareness, the perceptions that are performed, the temporary contents of our working memory. But what if we could look at it differently? What if we could ask the question, what is it that brains that have diminished consciousness, what is it that they share in common? What am I talking about? I'm talking about states like sleep, like anesthesia-induced unconsciousness, like coma. And many of these examples give us the possibility of a different kind of exploration. And it's an exploration that involves brain mapping. So now let's map across these systems and see what they might have in common. I do this using anesthesia. Anesthetic drugs affect the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And it's these drugs that make modern surgery possible. We give drugs to humans to make them blissfully unaware of the surgeon's knife. Those drugs bind to receptors in the brain to reversibly dissolve conscious awareness. And when surgery's over, we wash those drugs out of the brain and we watch consciousness reassemble itself. And guess what you can do? You can do what I'm doing here. You can put electrodes on the brain of a patient while they're undergoing the stages from being awake and aware to being blissfully unaware, to being blissfully unconscious. And then you can ask, what is it that we are seeing? What is it that we are measuring? Now, some people have asked, well, you're measuring electrical activity in the brain. If the brain is more conscious and then less conscious, is there less electrical activity? Turns out the answer is no. There's not less electrical activity, but it changes. And one of the things that happens to that electrical activity in the brain is it becomes hypersynchronous. In other words, the oscillations, the waves that you see in one part of the brain look almost identical to what you see in another part of the brain. And it turns out that this is one of the hallmarks of a decreased ability to calculate information, right? Your brain is a calculation machine. And when its level of consciousness becomes depressed, it has less ability to calculate information. So this was a theory of consciousness that has been elaborated by two neuroscientists, Christoph Koch and Julio Tononi, but it's not the only one. Other neuroscientists have looked at the brain as a functional network. And what you find is that during cases of decreased consciousness, things like anesthesia, the networks break. They functionally dissolve. So all those lines of communication that normally exist while we're all together and awake and talking and thinking with one another, they begin to break down and dissolve. And that's one of the ways in which information, all those stimuli that are coming from the environment, from the periphery, aren't interpreted at the center of our brain. Now, there are other metrics. This one is called complexity. We can think of our brain as a nonlinear system, so that means X doesn't always equal Y, and it's dynamical. And complexity is a way of characterizing this dynamism. And what we found is that when people are made unconscious through the use of things like anesthetic drugs, the complexity in their brain goes down, the diversity of neural signals goes down. Now, these are all three metrics we have used to characterize what makes brains unconscious. There's another way that people have tried to do it, and that is actually building artificial brains. So the question is, can you understand consciousness by trying to build a brain from the ground up? Could you, if you could create every nerve cell, every connection in silico, in electronics, could you actually approximate something that fires like a real living brain? This, by the way, fires like a living mouse brain right here. This is all artificial. And there are some neuroscientists who think that this is the way to go, and that this is the way we are also going to discover what it means to be conscious. This photograph is of someone named Francis Crick. Some of you may have heard of him. He was the co-discoverer and won the Nobel Prize for discovering the double helix structure of DNA. But later in his life, he became a neuroscientist, and he was very much interested in this problem of consciousness and thought that you could understand it by building it from the ground up. But there are other neuroscientists and neurophilosophers who think that's impossible. They think that that doesn't answer that hard problem of consciousness we talked about. So I'm going to suggest to you a heretical idea, a different idea. What if consciousness were not produced by the brain at all? What if it were an epiphenomenon of a complex system, something that we accessed in the outside world? What if consciousness was a description of the total information available in the universe? And that's consciousness with a big C. And consciousness with a little c is the filter that our brains use to reduce, to bind information, to process it, and to compute on it. Now that might sound very abstract, so we're going to use a real-world concrete example. Here's the visual system. Now we have 3 color photoreceptors in the back of our eye, and these receptors bind information coming in from something we call the electromagnetic spectrum, that color red that I was talking about. That's the rainbow we see, right? From red to indigo, okay? But look how much information we are throwing out from the electromagnetic spectrum. We never even bind or look at that information. Now this sweet creature, this is a mantis shrimp that exists on the coral reef. That shrimp has 3 to 4 times as many color photoreceptors as we do. And as a result, it sees a wider rainbow. It can see from infrared all the way into the ultraviolet, right? So if you compare the rainbow that a human sees and this mantis shrimp, completely different. So it's actually binding more information, taking in more information from the universe. Now, what do we do with this information? It goes into our eye, it gets computed on, it processed, more information can get thrown away, then it gets sent to the back of the brain to a place called the visual cortex, where we first begin to make sense of what we see. By the time it gets there, it's such a reduced, impoverished version of what existed in the real world that you could consider this almost a hallucination. It's not really fidelity. You and I all looking at each other, this is not a high-fidelity simulation. It's also not what a butterfly sees, or a shrimp, or a bird. We're all seeing a different reality, but it's a reality that helps us survive. So now let's go back and bring this, we talked about the electromagnetic spectrum for the visual system. Let's bring it back to all those bits of information available in the universe. There is a physicist named Seth Lloyd from MIT, and he tried to approximate how many bits of information exist in the universe by looking at the size of the universe, its age, its entropy, and he came up with something close to 10 to the 90th bits. That's a huge, huge number. And to put that into perspective, there are only about 10 to the 17th grains of sand in all the beaches and deserts on Earth, and only about 10 to the 22, 10 to the 24 stars in the observable universe. That's how many bits of information he estimated exist. Can you imagine a brain that could bind all this information as a total brain? No, it would burn out. It's too metabolically expensive. It's not possible to survive and do that. But you could imagine that the brain has become a reduced set of filters that can bind just enough information to produce a conscious perception that enables us to survive. And that's essentially what consciousness with a little c might be. And in fact, this makes consciousness analogous to that example from the visual system. The brain's visual system reduces the available information in the visual spectrum to something that we can use to survive as an organism. What if the whole brain was doing that with all those bits available in the universe? And this also suggests perhaps we don't know everything we need to know about the brain as a processor. Maybe there are quantum receptors in quantum computing. And this brings us then back to that heretical question. Consciousness may not be produced by the brain. It may be a property outside the brain, something that we begin to understand and bind and filter. And the ways in which consciousness might change is by changing the connections in that filter. That anesthetic drug example I gave you, those drugs are rewiring that filter. And we can do a thought experiment with this. We can ask ourselves, what if we were to do other things to retool that filter? By learning, experience, sleep, dreaming, psychedelic drugs perhaps. And it turns out that this is true as well. There is some evidence that drugs like LSD actually change the functional connections in the brain and change the way it processes information. LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, DMT, all of these increased connections, they seem to increase, not decrease, but increase information processing. And they increase complexity in the brain and the diversity of neural signals. All those three metrics I was talking about when we talked about how the brain has diminished levels of consciousness. So what does this imply? The brain under psychedelics, the brain under meditation, might actually be in heightened or supraconscious states. And this gives us a way, scientifically, to understand what that means. And taking that thought experiment a little bit further, it actually gives us the possibility of thinking about artificial brains, complex machines becoming conscious. Why? Because if they attain a certain degree of complexity, it's possible that they too can bind information in the universe and begin to form conscious percepts of it that enable them to move through their ecological niche. We might be able to observe emerging sentience with an ability to evolve. Another thought experiment. What happens to consciousness when this dies, right? Those neural networks that are supporting that consciousness with a C, what happens? Is there some trace of this information that's left behind in the universe? Another issue is, if that's true, that would mean that consciousness is non-local, right? And if it's non-local, can it be moved around? Can it also be moved from, say, an organic body to body? An avatar to an avatar? That's essentially what reincarnation is. Could it move to a new location in the more Judeo-Christian sort of view? But could it potentially move from an organic avatar to an inorganic one? Have any of you ever heard, sort of in science fiction, of this idea of uploading your consciousness? And could you move it from one inorganic to another inorganic one? Could machines move consciousness around? All interesting questions. And finally, this idea of mapping consciousness to understand our origins helps us understand consciousness in other species as well. This idea of mapping, it's really useful when you can't talk to the creature, right? So if you use these mapping techniques, you can learn something about their brains, their nervous system, their consciousness filters. There are other techniques for understanding intelligence in other species. We actually can try and communicate with them. We've been able to teach some of our nearest relatives, like gorillas, to communicate with us in sign language. We can also observe indirectly animal behavior. Some animals can look into a mirror and they can recognize themselves. That's a form of self-awareness. Includes things like dolphins and some primates and elephants can look into a mirror, and at a younger age than a human child, they can recognize themselves. This video that you see here is of a dolphin that's noticed that it actually has a spot painted on its belly, and it's mugging for the mirror to take a look at it. It knows that it's its own reflection in that mirror. Finally, what we may be able to learn from mapping consciousness in brains, we might be able to move this to looking for consciousness within the universe. Think of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We're looking for biosignatures. I talked about functional connectivity, information, complexity. These are all tools and techniques we can use to search the skies for other conscious life forms. We could look for intelligence, but intelligence is just one dimension along this entire spectrum. Consciousness encompasses an entire network architecture that has woken up, that has become sentient. And with astrophysics, with the Hubble Space Telescope, with the recent launch of the James Webb Telescope, we're finding more and more exoplanets in other galaxies that we didn't know existed that are in the Goldilocks zone that could support the production of life, the evolution of life. So we may be able to use our techniques for mapping consciousness here on Earth to find that we're not alone. With that, I thank you very much, and I will be in the Abundance Dome later so we can have a much longer session and you can ask me anything that you would like. Thank you.